I'm Robert Steele. I'm postdoctoral fellow in contemporary Iranian studies at UCLA, and I had a PhD in Arab and Islamic studies from the University of Exeter.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much for joining us today, Robert. And I'm really excited to be talking about your book. I'm just going to hold the e-copy up there. It's the Shah's Imperial Celebrations of 1971. And I think it's a fantastic book. I've really enjoyed reading it so far. And I think it's a book that we've been waiting for a long time. Finally, a proper study of these infamous celebrations in this infamous party. And I thought a good place to start is to begin with, what led you to write this book? Why did you focus on this topic?
My first degree was in ancient history,
Oh,
and then from ancient history I went to did my master's in international relations, um, and then I was sort of wanting to do a PhD. I wasn't sure on the topic, so at first I was going to do wanted to do 18th century Iran, and Nader Shah. And then I was decided to do something on Britain and Iran in the late Qajar period. And then I was sort of talking to Oliver Bast at Manchester University, and we sort of, I don't know, we sort of together came up with this idea to look at British academia and the 2500th anniversary celebrations. And that was an MPhil project. And during that project, there was sort of, I found that there wasn't much secondary literature on the 2500th anniversary celebrations. I mean, most of my sources for that thesis were, I mean, all primary sources from the British, mainly from British archives, and interviews with scholars who were around at the time. For example, David Stronach. So I really did notice that there was a sort of a gap in the literature that should be plugged.
yes.
And then I took a bit of time out and decided to do a PhD on the 2500th anniversary celebrations and try to really give a sort of comprehensive, objective analysis of the event. And the book is a product of that PhD thesis.
I see. That's interesting, and you're absolutely right. I mean, for scholars who work on modern Iranian history, we look at this party a lot, but actually we don't know much about it. I think we know the prejudice around it and the kind of historical narratives and agendas that surround the party, as in it led to the revolution and that kind of thing, but we don't have a proper analysis of it.
It's true, and even on the, so I focus quite a lot on the academic side of it and the cultural events that were held around the world. And when I was doing the MPhil on British academia and the celebrations, I was told by at least one academic or one British scholar that it's really, he said, I don't want to put you off studying this, but really academics just ignored the celebrations. They had no real interest in it at all. But what I found was the exact opposite. And the reason why is because no one's really written about it before. The only person who's written anything about the scholarly aspects of the event is really Ghulam Reza Afkhami in his book on the Shah. And he talks a little bit about some of these, the Congress of Iranology, for example. But there's not much else written about it.
No, and that's the thing that for me as a reader is striking, is that they had all of these other conferences, Iranology conferences that were held at the same time, and those things have just been overshadowed or just been taken out of the historical narrative of the party. We just focus on the party, not really realizing that there were other things going on at the same time. And in terms of contribution, do you see it as something for the general public, for academics, a bit of a mix?
I mean, because it is one of these iconic moments of the Pahlavi period, there will, I mean, undoubtedly be interest from general public, but I also hope it's going to be a good scholarly contribution. I do wanted to think about in Pahlavi studies, essentially, in particular, there are lots of these sort of ideas that we have about Slavi celebrations is always considered to have been like evidence of the megalomania of the Shah, and it was It was hundreds of millions of dollars spent, and it was this horrible event. But I do try to question this sort of established narrative, and I think hopefully other scholars will will continue to do this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
and I think it's also one of those celebrations and events which actually has a very much a global history as well. Recently, for example, I was looking at Malaysian and Iranian relations, and I think our king at the time actually went to these celebrations, and this was a huge thing for a country like Malaysia. To have been part of the Shah's orbit at that time was a very important thing for Malaysia's international relations. And it's just those little narratives that have been cut out by a particular narrative of seeing the Shah in a negative light. So
it's true, yeah, and people often focus on the fact that President Nixon and Queen Elizabeth and President Pompidou declined their invitations as sort of evidence that the Shah wasn't taken particularly seriously by international powers. And there's one article in Newsweek, for example, that published, I think, a couple of years after the celebrations, but it says that the Shah invited virtually anybody who was anybody, but mostly nobody showed up.
Oh.
Yeah, and I thought that was quite, I thought the invitation of the leaders from Malaysia and from the rest of the sort of global South was really a hugely important part of the Shah's foreign policy.
Absolutely.
And at this point, we see, especially from 1971, after the Shah had achieved sort of supremacy of the Persian Gulf, we do see the Shah emerging as a leader in the global South and trying to present himself as someone who states can turn to as an alternative to the great powers. And we see this especially in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, where the Shah went round and he commented quite often on shared experiences of colonialism. So the Shah was obviously invaded by the British and Russians in the Second World War.
That's right.
So when he spoke to people like Haile Selassie, who was also invaded by the fascists, he can talk about, we've also suffered from colonialism, and now Africa is a sort of a stage in the Cold War. He could present his Iran as an alternative to the great powers in this competition.
No, that's very interesting, and it's the same with Malaysia as a former British colony. Seeing the Shah sort of resonated with them, that kind of shared experience of poor treatment under the British, let's say, and his visit to Malaysia was very important. And I think these kind of ideas that Queen Elizabeth, President Nixon, all of these Western leaders didn't come to the party, it's a very Eurocentric view, because actually his impact was very important in other parts of the world. So I think that's also where the book really helps to fill that gap in a way.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah.
Yeah. In terms of your research journey, I'm a little bit interested to hear how that's been. You mentioned quite a lot of archives, and you mentioned specifically the Dutch and I think Austrian as well, and German. Why did you focus on those?
Yeah, the Dutch was mainly because my wife is Dutch. So, and one time we were on, I think it was a Christmas holiday. We were in Holland, and we decided one day, well, let's go to look in The Hague and see what the National Archives say and about the celebrations, because that's what that was my subject. And I wasn't expecting to find much, but there was a huge folder of documents relating to the celebrations, and it was I found it incredibly interesting. And now, whenever I do any starting a research project, I go to the Dutch archives, because they are quite similar to the British in that they have a very professional diplomatic service. They recorded stuff quite diligently. For example, even when the Shah visited Haile Selassie, there is a file in the Dutch archives from the Dutch embassy in Addis Ababa about the Shah's visit. And they recorded stuff really well. And so it's great resources.
Oh, that's fantastic. It's a good tip, good pro tip there.
Yeah, of course, yeah. And the Vienna, the Austrian archives was also because I was living in Vienna at the time, and just thought I'd sort of check it out. Yeah, so, but there are so many archives. And the good thing about the celebrations is that, like you say, it was a global event. There were so many countries involved that most state archives will probably have something on them.
That's true.
It was a
That's
huge
true.
event.
It
Yeah,
was.
and then one of the main resources was the archive of Shojadin Shafar in Paris. Um, and Shafar was obviously, he came up with the idea for the celebrations in 1958.
Right. Yes,
He was the
I did not
Shah's.
know that it was in the works for so long. It struck me.
Yeah, yeah, and he was the Shah's cultural advisor at the Imperial Court for a long time, from 1957 until essentially the revolution. And he was involved in most of the key cultural initiatives organized by the court. So his archive is just a treasure trove of information on so many subjects.
Amazing.
Such a great resource.
Incredible. And in your research journey and working on this book, what would you say was the most striking thing? What was for you personally, your most interesting discovery?
I think it was about narratives, really, in that what I found in the archives and from doing original research was basically went against everything that I've read in books about the anniversary celebrations. For example, the cost. You just see these numbers thrown around. The $300 million, $200 million. I've even read newspapers that say $3 billion was spent on the celebrations.
Oh, wow.
So these figures go into huge sums. And another sort of narrative is that all of this was money squandered.
Yeah.
And what I found from looking at the primary sources, including documents and accounts from the organizing committee of the celebrations, is first of all that the numbers were much lower, and second of all that a lot of the money went to infrastructural projects and things that would have a long-lasting impact on the economy, particularly the tourism industry. Right. So I found that the tourism numbers increased in the 2 years after the celebrations by around 35%. And this was actually one of the main purposes of the celebrations. The head of the Iranian National Tourism Organization was actually on the organizing committee of the celebrations. And from the very beginning, it was sort of the idea was to use the celebrations to boost the tourism numbers in the country and boost tourism income.
And did it? Do you know? Do you know?
It was very successful.
Look at that.
Yeah, they were very successful.
No, that's fascinating, and it's important. It's important to sort of look at these things and see it from different angles. How about in terms of national identity? Did that? I read in your book that they sent the Cyrus cylinder all over the place. I mean, did it help with the Shah's image and the kind of image that he wanted to portray?
I think internationally, it did. The problem was that in the years following the celebrations, I mean, I don't think the regime was particularly good at PR. It was good at PR internationally, and presenting the Cyrus cylinder, this bill of human rights, and that side of it was quite successful. And presenting the Shah as a leader in the global South, this was very successful. But in the country itself, I don't think it was. They kept holding these celebrations, these commemorations, and trying to increase the Shah's legitimacy. For example, the 10th anniversary of the White Revolution in 1973, then the 50th anniversary of Pahlavi rule, and the setting up of the Rastakhi's party. None of these were particularly successful in sort of improving the image of the Shah inside Iran and increasing his legitimacy. And on the other side, the Shah's opponents increased in their sort of in their size and in their popularity in the years after the celebrations. So in that respect, I see that the celebrations were a huge PR failure. domestically, but a PR success internationally.
Oh, that's a great way to see it, and going to give us a lot of thought, I think, as well. So, I mean, so this is sort of like a last question. In the end, do you think that the celebrations did they contribute to the revolution? I suppose you've answered that a little bit, but in the end, are some of the narratives justified in terms of the spending and in terms of its image?
In terms of the image, it did give these sort of opponents of the Shah, these disparate groups with different motives. They sort of came together in common opposition to the Shah, and that's really in 1971 probably the first time that really happens. And I think in that way it was an important moment. But I don't think necessarily it was the celebrations themselves. I think it was more the fact that the regime didn't really deal with it. There are examples in, so the Savak documents show that Savak was well aware of the fact that people were talking about the cost, and rumors abound about how much the celebrations cost around in the bazaar and everywhere else. And yet the regime did very little to counter that. For example, there was a Savak document that says people were complaining that hundreds of thousands of dollars were spent on a certain project, and then 2 days later, there's an article in Etala'at which celebrates the fact that Iran has just signed a sort of $150,000 deal with a British lighting company to provide lights in 1 week for the celebration, that sort of thing. So I think from and then after the celebrations, the regime didn't really, they sort of swept it under the carpet. They couldn't be bothered tackling these criticisms. They just ignored them and hoped that they'd go away, and then moved on to the next celebration, which was the 10th anniversary of the White Revolution. And so I don't think the regime took the opposition to the celebrations seriously enough, and I think that was
so it wasn't the celebrations per se. It was more about the response and the reaction to it that probably didn't help.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, but it is true that the celebrations did become a part of the narrative of the Shah's downfall. And at the time of the revolution, there was people still referred back to the celebrations as this moment that showed the Shah's megalomania. And so in that respect, it was an important moment in the revolution, but not necessarily. You can't say that the celebrations happened and then the revolution happened.
Of course, no, you can't really just I can't draw a line now. Yeah. But I like what you say. What you said in the introduction is that it's a calmer way of looking at the celebrations, a more measured and a proper analysis of it, which I think is very necessary. Sort of trying to situate the celebrations within the wider narrative of recent and modern Iranian Pahlavi history. So looking forward to reading the rest of the book. But thank you so much, Robert, for your time and for sharing your research journey with us. And I hope you've enjoyed the conversation as well.
Yeah, no.
Thank you very much.
No, thanks a lot.